Hello, I'm Hannah Kuchler. I'm the FT's US Pharma and Biotech Correspondent, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this FT Medidata session on fast-forwarding the future of clinical trials, how COVID-19 sparked a revolution in virtualization and patient centricity. Clinical trials are the art of getting the right information as quickly and simply as possible. Companies rely on participants often struggling with their own illnesses and disease to lend their time, and they have the responsibility to make the most of it. The better we get at clinical trials, the more drugs we should be able to have to help the patients of the future. Our esteemed panelists were already working on using new technologies to improve this process, whether you want to call it virtualization, decentralization, or hybrid models, when COVID hit. Today, we get to hear about what happened then, how it changed an already challenging process, and most importantly, what changes we expect to see for the longer term. So I'd love to welcome you all and thank Medidata for partnering with us. I'd like to thank our speakers and our delegates for participating. And we'd love to hear from our delegates. So we're working on the event platform Bizzabo, and delegates can ask questions via the chat function on the right-hand side at any time. So what I'll try and do is I'll come to those questions if we're in the flow of the conversation and they're relevant, or if they're on a slightly different topic, we'll come to them at the end. If you have any issues whatsoever, please email ftlive@ft.com. And we also love to hear your thoughts and tweets on social media using the hashtag #FTHealth and hashtag #FTDigitalDialogues. So now I'm going to welcome our panelists. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Lionel Bascles, who's the Senior Vice President, the Global Head of Clinical Sciences and Operations at Sanofi. Antony Costello, the President of Patient Cloud at Medidata. Jessica Scott, Head of R&D Patient Engagement at Takeda. And Badhri Srinivasan. He told me I didn't have to say his last name, and I really wanted to give it a go, and I really butchered it, so I'm very sorry. Head of Global Development Operations at Novartis. Now, I'm going to ask Jessica this first, and then I want to hear from everybody. What happened when the pandemic hit this time last year to all the clinical trials that you had in progress? And what did you do to keep up?
Right. Well, in the very short term, our first step, Hannah, was as an organization that we needed to take a look at how to keep patients safe. And from the patient engagement office where I sit and our clinical operations group, we needed to look at not enrolling more patients until we could keep the patients that were enrolled safe, which meant how do we ensure that we could continue to monitor safety and give medications on trial, and look at how we could do that with home visits potentially so that they didn't have to come into medical centers and so forth. So in the very immediate term, it was a matter of kind of pausing until we could understand the situation and how to keep our patients on trial safe. We very quickly realized that we could move with our existing patients to continue the trials that they were in, pause on enrolling new patients until we could see how to progress, and pause on starting new trials. And within a few months, we could move forward, and now we're at full speed. So from a patient engagement perspective, what we also realized is that we needed to think about how we move to more virtualized clinical trials and use the learnings that we had started the year before in thinking about decreasing the burden of clinical trial participation through more virtual clinical trial elements that we had begun to learn about and implement in terms of recommendations across the organization that would decrease the burden from the patient perspective. And this was really a forcing factor, a catalyst, if you will, to bring those decentralized clinical trial elements quickly to the forefront, as we're going to discuss more today. what we've seen over this past year is that as you start to implement and move forward, what seemed like this straight path toward virtual clinical trials from the 30,000-foot view, we're finally here, we've got this forcing factor with COVID. Now we can move forward in a way that we have not had before, with greater flexibility from all stakeholders, including regulators and IRBs and internal functions in the organization. We had to start looking at, okay, it's not all easier, and we need to keep checking back with patients to say, do we have this right? It's like driving on a straight road from the 30,000-foot view looks very straight, but when you're actually driving, you have to move and turn, you have to shift, you have to take into account what's actually happening on the ground. And that's what we've been experiencing this past year, which has been very interesting. And the important thing to remember is to constantly check back with our patients and engage and collaborate to make sure that we're getting it right.
I love that simile. It is a journey where there's some bends that might be slightly unexpected from the long view. Lionel, why don't you tell us what happened at Sanofi when the pandemic hit and how you kept your trials on track?
Absolutely. So when the pandemic started, so we had the responsibility towards 27,000 patients, so who have been recruited over more than 300 studies, managing by more than 4,000 sites and 45 countries. So that's the magnitude, and really, as Jessica mentioned, well, our first priority was to maintain the safety and the treatment continuity for the patients. So if you recall the sequence of events, so we had a business continuity plan activated in China, and rapidly towards the end of February, we globalized, so we generalized this business continuity plan to all the countries and all the studies. And again, keeping in mind that the first priority is treatment continuation, patient safety. So first, well, I will use the analogy you remember when we were traveling and taking a plane, that, well, we were asked in case of air drop or air pressure problem, there will be the oxygen mask, and you need to put the mask on your nose before attending to anyone else. So we said, well, we need to take care of our team and make sure that they can, if we want really them to be able to take care of the patients. So over a few days, everyone was remote and connected with all the tools, to all the tools and systems. And here I need to thank our partners as well, because they have facilitated that aspect. And in parallel, we have streamlined our clinical operation, the clinical supply, because we wanted to really refocus the activity, maintaining them on site, to make sure that we could provide the resupply needed, connecting with the site. So it's been a sort of military organization where in the countries, we are clinical study units working remotely, connecting with the sites, and communicating with the supply operations, making sure that we would have the supply. Thankfully, we had this experience on shipment direct to patient, what we call in our jargon DTP. Except that on a yearly basis, we were used to run, 50 of them, mainly for rare disease, because this is a part of our expertise we have at Sanofi. Well, last year we did 2,000 of them, so 40 on a week, and we even did the first one in China ever. So I'm really extremely proud of my team, of the investigators, partners, and support we get from the authorities to maintain the patients. We calculated 98% of the patients who were ongoing on trials have been maintained. So we did not only maintain the activity, we also progressed our portfolio. And we even managed to start new studies, including 12 pivotal trials. And as Jessica mentioned, well, it's an even greater responsibility in such circumstances to start a new study, because you want to make sure that the patient will be safely enrolled and treated and followed, and you're not going to lose the patient, you're going to lose visits. So we assess all opportunity to gain flexibility, again, with authorities, agencies, to say our flexibility, what is the flexibility in the visits, in the assessment, bringing the stats teams into the play, but also looking into technology. I believe now we have 50% of our phase 3 trials with DCT component. And here again, we tapped into experience we had, because 5 years ago we invested into a decentralized approach and piloted it. Again, very much more on the rare disease front, because the hybrid model of a study is very fit for purpose for rare disease. It is interesting that we see the rare disease approach moving towards more indication. But I agree with Jessica in terms of agility. It's not one size fits all. We're looking at every study differently.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So Badhri, what happened to you at Novartis when the pandemic hit, and any sort of differences and similarities with what the other panelists have said so far?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of similarities as well. So thanks for the question, Hannah. Look, I mean, I'm going to be a bit dramatic, right? First, nothing happened. Nothing really happened. It broke in China, and in February, it broke in China. I really recall the time distinctly. We were actually having an offsite outside Zurich, and me and my leadership team was there. We watched it. The WHO declared an epidemic, not a pandemic. And they said, it's going to be contained, maybe spill over to a few neighboring countries. And our China team ramped up, handled the issue beautifully. Everything was in place. They took care of everything. Then it started to slowly gain steam. Then comes March, and then it really kind of took off, right? So, and I just want to say that because in the beginning, it was all a bit like, oh yeah, it's a bit surreal, actually. So everybody's watching it. Look, but a lot of similarities. The first thing for us was the safety and well-being of our associates. We just want to make sure that everybody was really well taken care of. Nobody got caught in the middle of this or got caught in an area where they had traveled. As you know, before this, everybody traveled all the time, and they got caught in a region where they should be, we should help them to get out, and so on and so forth. That was the first thing. The second thing is, and very much similar to what Jessica and Lionel said, we were focused on patient safety, data integrity, and actually trying to see what we could do to help our investigators as well. They're also in an awkward position. They got caught in the middle of this, and all of a sudden their priorities have changed to dealing with emergency situations they're not equipped for. So how do we actually work in that situation? A lot of our associates really landed up helping and extending their help to investigators and going above and beyond. So the size of the problem for us, 60 plus countries, 100,000 patients, 20 to 30,000 investigative sites. I mean, these are large numbers, many hundreds of trials. So we immediately moved to create a governance framework around it, a steering committee for it, a SWAT team around it. And we quickly found that one of the bottlenecks was also decision-making, decisions on when do we stop a site or shut down a site, or do we continue, et cetera, et cetera. So we established what we call as a clearinghouse. A clearinghouse was essentially put together to say, you have the authority to clear all decisions in less than 24 hours. And that really helped us, because then we kept the machine moving. And that governance mechanism of the SWAT, the steerco, and the clearinghouse really kept the machine on. We never stopped our programs, if you will. We paused. We also we have a lot of IT infrastructure in place, or systems infrastructure in place. We quickly created our own monitoring tool that started telling us in a predictive way, what are the hotspots? Where are emerging blooms, if you will, of infections? What are emerging areas where we should watch for? And where are the infection rates going down? So we were constantly pivoting so that we were making sure that we were opening up in areas where it was going down, ramping up in areas where it's going down, really cautious in areas where it was not, et cetera, et cetera. So the combination of people, the combination of technology really brought us together to be able to address this very robustly. To Lionel's point, right, we kept continuing our programs. We kept continuing to open new programs as well. Research doesn't take a pause. Development doesn't take a pause. Things do keep moving on. And we were right lockstep in with that. Just to give you a quick fact, and then I'll turn it back over to you. We've been obviously piloting a lot of the decentralized approaches, et cetera, et cetera. if you had asked me at the beginning of 2020, I said, yeah, maybe, 15, 20% of activities would be somewhere in that area. We landed up the end of the year with 96 to 97% of our activities that way. So it tells you the hard pivot that we had to do as well.
That is a very hard pivot, and I definitely want to come back and talk about the cultural issues that you mentioned, how you make decisions, how you make sure that everyone's on board with those. So Antony, you have this fantastic overview of so many different companies trying to do this at once. Was there a big range in how people approach this and what they're doing in terms of laying the foundations for clinical trials of the future?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Hannah. It's great hearing these stories because I think it really represents the speakers here today represent kind of a microcosm of what we were seeing across the industry at the beginning of the pandemic with, Medidata having hundreds of partners and customers that were all in the same situation at the same time. It really shone a light on how quickly can we move in some of these areas when we need to. And, I think I love the comments and the stories about quick pivots. I think that's exactly what we saw. Many customers, including all the panelists here today, were already experimenting and in some cases doing more than just experimenting with decentralized study capabilities and technologies. And I think what COVID brought was a set of circumstances where you had to very quickly spin up, if you hadn't already started, you were spinning up pilots and experimenting with sites and patients and trying to figure out the best way to implement this new suite of tools. If you had already been experimenting and maybe had some favorite vendors or some favorite tactics or some SOPs or staff kind of re-geared around this approach, then you were in a position to scale very quickly. And we saw that. We saw customers all the way across the board from how do we spin up a few technologies to get started here to customers like Badhri mentioned, just going all in on virtualization and really trying to transform the patient site experience literally kind of overnight to be able to keep some of these protocol visit schedules on the rails. We're also looking at this geographically. I know we're going to probably later in the conversation get into some more detail on that, but we saw anywhere from a 50% to, in some regions, an 85% drop off immediately in site visits. So you're talking about lots and lots of studies where site visits just simply came to a screeching halt. And we all recognize that you can't keep a protocol on track for very long if you've got something like an 85% dip in site visit adherence. And that gets to be very challenging for these studies in a place where some of this technology last year was really able to jump in and make a big difference. So I think the other thing I wanted to mention here is that over the course of the year, we ended up working on literally hundreds of COVID studies at Medidata, including most of the very large mega studies that you hear about in the news all the time that have kind of turned into the vaccines now. And that really provided, I think, another very special proof point for this topic, right? We've done lots of virtualization now on lots of very large studies spread all over, run very, very quickly, where data quality and safety and monitoring are all sort of utmost importance because you're doing everything 10 times faster than normal. And in many of those cases, the technology and the approach with patients and the ability to move fast and still get quality data proved to be quite successful. And I think I'm hopeful, and I think the panelists probably share this hope that we will be able to take some of these capabilities now forward, maybe in a little bit more rational settings where we're running studies, maybe not quite such a breakneck speed, but certainly still with an eye towards how do we always make clinical research less burdensome for patients and sites.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about sort of sustaining that momentum. And I think that I'm already seeing some fantastic questions coming in from the audience. And so one of the overarching themes on this really is like, where does this work and where doesn't this? Badhri, you said that you had, moved to 96, 97%. Do you think you're going to keep that up? Or do you realize that when we're going back to something more like normal, what will virtualization work for and where is it less useful?
Yeah, great question. Look, I mean, what we do in times of an emergency or a disruption, massive worldwide disruption, I think is a bit different than what we would do when we have a steady state. So will it hold up to 96, 97%? I don't think it will, and I don't think it should, because there's a lot of trials that need, if you will, a different kind of a model. There are a lot of trials that need a virtual model, and everything in between. So I think it is appropriate to tailor it to what is needed and the portfolio you have, the patient response that is needed, how can we unburden, if you will, for patients, etc. That's one thing. Second is, I think there's also going to be a distinction of what should be, if you will, digital, virtual, etc., versus what shouldn't be. Sometimes patients, especially patients who have, advanced disease states or end-of-life conditions, etc., they want the human touch. They would like to be there with you. So let's be careful as well that we don't over-mechanize something as opposed to getting the right levels, if you will. That's a second. Third, and I know this will probably be a further exploration in this meeting, there's a cultural element here as well. There's a mindset shift here as well. So I think we need to be mindful of the mindset shift and cultural element that is needed to sustain this going forward. So I think in short, Hannah, what I would say is it's a hard pivot that tells us what is possible, but also let's be careful about what is needed to make sure that we bring that balance back into this going forward.
Jessica, you had already, done some of the planning to make this move anyway. Did you have a clear idea of which maybe disease areas or geographic areas this works best for beforehand, and has it changed?
There's a lot of shifting going on. I think Badhri's really brought up some great points. It's kind of like a teeter-totter or a seesaw, depending on where you're from. The balance, right, is going to differ depending on the type of trial, the phase, how invasive, how much risk to monitor patients, whether you do home infusions that need a lot of monitoring, that may not be the right kind of trial to decentralize as much as a different kind of trial. So these are considerations that will help shape which trials are decentralized more than others. As Badhri said, there are a lot of other factors, and I like the point about the human touch. I mean, for example, when we think about getting to remote areas, geographically remote areas, and we're working with a CRO partner, for example, and that CRO partner is contracting with a visiting healthcare provider to conduct some of these home visits. We might be sending that individual to an environment that's risky, right? That a neighborhood that carries risk, and a neighborhood that may have very little access to ongoing health care and may have expectations for, could you please look at this? Can you look at my son's this? And this pull that the healthcare providers may not be equipped to cope with. There may be safety issues for that individual that we need to work through and deal with. In addition, the idea that the relationship with a site that's so important for patients' engagement and trust with the clinical trial now comes down to the trust with the individuals coming to the home instead. And if we're allotting 15 minutes for that visit to give a medication or to draw blood, that's not enough time to establish the relationship. So all these considerations go into how we operationalize this decentralized trial in a way that's going to work.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's really complicated. Mm-hmm. I know you were talking about how some of what you'd ended up doing during the pandemic was based on what you'd done for rare diseases before. Now, where do you see how applicable these new technologies and approaches are?
Indeed. So direct-to-patient delivery, decentralized approach was something, sometimes not even digital decentralized approach, because we used to have remote visits, I mean, organized remote visits or traveled patients. I mean, we in rare disease studies, we would adapt, including flexible assessment to make sure that we would adapt to the patients. So basically what we've seen last year is that we could tap into this opportunity to industrialize that across the portfolio. When it comes to digital and the opportunity for digital, I really like the human touch. I believe that this is really a way to integrate and strengthen the relationship that exists between the doctor, the treating physician, and the patient. The ability to really strengthen it and well, leverage it to a higher level. It should not be intrusive to the patient life, and that's really what we want to consider. When I reflect on the clinical trials, often I feel like it's like a bubble. You know, we create a bubble in which we for the assessment of a drug into where the patients are included. It looks like a very different track from the normal healthcare journey, despite we want to recreate some of this. I believe that the digital should reconnect those tracks. And that should be what we should be looking forward, and not creating an additional element that would make the clinical trials stronger and more resilient. By the way, when we were able to maintain all our patients and continue and progress the research, and Badhri, I like your comment. I mean, yes, the research never stopped, and there was a fight against COVID-19, against the collateral effect of COVID-19, making sure that patients in need could have access to innovative treatment. So this was the objective we had in mind. But at the same time, we all see the stat where a number of patients have not been diagnosed, 20% delay in diagnosis in cancer, access to treatment. So that means that as much as we can increase the resilience of the clinical trials, we have also to pay attention to e-health and the ability for patients in their usual environment to be treated and to access to the clinic and hospital. So I guess that connecting the two is really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Antony, we're getting some questions in which I think would be good for you. One question is there an issue of scale here where bigger companies have an advantage in doing virtual trials? Obviously, everyone else on the panel represents bigger companies, but Antony, you must work with some smaller companies. How are they coping with this switch?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, but I think, you know, interestingly, already, even in this conversation, you've heard rare disease trials come up a few times, right? So in many cases, I think historically, some of the most innovative approaches that we see on these studies are from the smaller organizations or the smaller studies, the harder to enroll patients, the studies that are necessarily decentralized in a way because you don't have 27 rare disease patients that can all go to a single study center. You're opening 27 centers to see 27 patients, and in many cases, those centers are widely dispersed. So, you know, I think there are advantages to larger organizations because if they make the investment, the technology investment in kind of switching to a decentralized process, then they can leverage that transformation in more pipeline, right? They've got more studies to kind of use that transformed approach than maybe smaller organizations do. But we definitely see, you know, again, it's been really interesting to watch as someone who's been working on virtual trials and electronic consent and ePro and some of these technologies for a long, long time now. It's been really interesting for me to see how quickly companies really across the board have moved to make this change. And I think that the other thing I just want to build on something Badhri said and something Jessica touched on earlier, there's, you know, we really are focused on choice and burden reduction. It's not just a technology story. And I think that's really important. If you look at companies that are gearing up for this transformation or trying to decide, you know, what of the things we did last year do we really want to carry forward in our clinical development programs? When you look at that, you're not just seeing these companies kind of focus on technology. They're talking about changing the way their teams work, changing the way site engagement works, changing the way site selection works, looking at things like home nursing and local labs in patient communities as opposed to site visits. And technology is a piece of it, but I think it's important to maybe debunk the misnomer that what we mean by decentralized trials is there will be no more site visits. And another one that what we mean by technology is that it can solve all of these issues, right? So
yes,
you know,
it's not a Fitbit running a trial.
That's right. Technology by itself will not solve recruitment problems. It won't solve diversity problems. It won't solve burden problems. It won't solve data quality problems, right? In and of itself, there needs to really be a new way of looking across the board at how we run these studies, where technology might help enhance some choice for patients in certain situations, and certainly some choice for sponsors. But like Badhri says, there are many, many cases where technology is not the right solution, and decentralization is certainly not the right solution everywhere.
Can I build on that a moment? Anthony, I know Medidata was present. We held a pre-competitive collaboration with 11 of our preferred technology partners along with our patient advisors to come together and think about the digital tools that will help us move toward decentralized clinical trials, and brainstormed 200 ideas and came out with 11 actionable items to move forward with that would work for patients to decrease the burden, and collaborated on how to integrate those tools in ways that will work on the ground. So that was like, now we're driving, what are we going to do? And that you hit on the point about what patients want is the flexibility to decide, you know, I'd like to have this visit at home because I've got young children and I don't want somebody coming in to babysit during COVID because I'm not comfortable with that, but I'll let somebody come in and have a visit at home. I'm comfortable with telehealth. But then another person might want to go to a local lab because they have elderly parents and don't want the exposure to their parents at home. And then there's still other people who have different perspectives. And so that shared decision-making, the flexibility, how do I get my virtual hug? Some people want to come into a site, and building that in and a shared decision-making process is what it's all about.
That actually resonates with one question that maybe one of you can take from the audience, which is there any evidence that virtual trials have better levels of patient compliance? I mean, I think this, yes, Antony, do you have evidence?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You have numbers, Anthony?
Yeah. Well, so maybe just let me take one step back from that question and say, if your organization's been running ePro studies for, you know, the last 15 or 20 years, then that is an element of virtualization, right? If you're doing virtual visits over video conferences, that's virtualization. If you're allowing patients to consent from home, that's virtualization. It doesn't necessarily mean, at least in our definition, at Medidata, we created this concept we call the trial dial, and it's sort of this imaginary big, huge dial that you can turn all the way from a site visit to all the way to a virtual visit. And we want to be able to accommodate any part of where you might kind of twist that dial. So you might have lots and lots of studies running just ePro or just ePro with virtual visits over video conferencing. To us, that's just a point on that trial dial that gives choice to patients, choice to sites, choice to sponsors, and then maybe gives you a little bit of risk protection against a situation like a pandemic quarantine where everything just comes to a screeching halt. But we know that getting data from patients in real time in a daily ePro form is much better than trying to ask them those types of quality of life questions every 6 weeks when they come to a site visit. Like, we know that's a better way to do it. And we know patients don't want to travel to a site to sign an amended consent form where 3 sentences of the consent have changed if they can sign that at home. right? So there are quality opportunities here to get data at the source in much more real time, integrated in the patient's life. And then there are a ton of convenience, burden reduction opportunities, even if there's no change in quality. If you can reduce the burden and be more engaging for the patient on these studies, then we know that there's big effects and impacts caused by that to kind of improve the way patients look at their participation in clinical research.
Lionel?
Okay, so yeah, I guess that the way I see the decentralized trials, I mean, particularly in the hybrid model, it's a continuum of what has been done. I mean, a few years ago, we were running phone visits for safety checking. Now we had EPRO, I mean, run from home or other type of data, and we moved to having some visits and rebuilding the site environment around the patient in a way. Where I want to raise a point of vigilance is in the multiplication of the technology that we can push at home, at the patient home. And I remember having a study run in respiratory disease where we had wearables, we had spirometry, we had EPRO, so the top of the technology. And actually the patient complained about the multiple interfaces that they had to manage. On top of which sometimes those interfaces cannot be uploaded on their own device. So we have to ship some specific devices, so that had to the confusion. So that's something we need to pay attention to. And also that's a call I'm making to our tech companies and partners, say we need to integrate that. We need to integrate all that flow, because having one simple interface for the patient, my study, you know, and then they can access to all the study flow, the visits, the assessment they need to do on their own device, what we call in our jargon, the BYOD, bring your own device. That would be awesome, because today there's a lot of complexity and burden that is pushed now to the patient, and we have to pay attention to that. When we run the survey, we receive that concern clearly from the patient.
Badhri?
Can I build on that?
Of course.
There are 3 points I want to bring, right? So one is, we talked about compliance, but I think that the word compliance actually has a larger connotation here. Virtualization, I think these kinds of digitalization, for lack of a better word, even a larger umbrella, I think it does 3 things. One, for example, many assessments are created today that we use today for the times when we didn't have these things digitally. So you would come in the clinic, you would do a walk test, or you would do a stress test, etc., and then you'd go home. Instead, if you have a device that is continually monitoring, blood parameters, if you have a device that's continually monitoring, for example, your ability to walk or your movement, we're now talking continuous measures because it is digitally possible, as opposed to discrete measures because it wasn't possible. So the compliance aspect actually has a deeper connotation, because now we're actually talking more robust measurements to see how the patient is responding to treatment. Very different. The second thing I want to pick up, which you also may get to later on, is I believe it should lead, and it will lead to a bit of an egalitarianism, a democratization of being able to participate in trials. I'm living in a country, I'm living in a region that is very hard to get to. I don't have time because I run 3 jobs, etc. With this kind of virtualization, we should be able to get to you. There should not be any imbalances, if you will, whether in terms of diversity or country or any inclusion criteria or economic status, etc. I think digitalization should push in that direction, because then it really ensures an egalitarian way to treat clinical trials. That's the second thing I wanted to say. And the third one is the concept of human-centric design. I think a number of people, Antony touched on it quite a bit actually. This is going to be critical. We have a population now that's very used to an iPhone, an iPad. And then you come to a clinical trial software, and you can't but have it be as slick, as consumer-friendly, as easy to work with, as consumer-grade production software. Any clinical trial software ought to be as easy as an iPhone. Then you get compliance, and you get participation, you get less loss to follow-ups, you get higher data integrity.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really important what you both are bringing out here, which is that there's a big potential to increase the diversity and the access to trials, but we have to watch ourselves to make sure that we don't assume that everyone either has or can cope with the technologies in the same way. I want to move on. There's a lot of questions about what I would call money. So there are a lot of questions about, is running a virtual trial more or less expensive than a traditional trial? How do you measure ROI or the value proposition of a virtual trial? And do virtual trials increase speed for commercialization, which we also know is another way of saying, are they cheaper? So I don't know who wants to go over that first and talk through how you think about the costs around a virtual trial.
I can start. I mean, well, I guess that in the long run, there should be a decrease in cost. Today, what we see, what we experience is that we are adding this new capability, this option to the patients on top of the infrastructure that we are building already for clinical trials. So with decentralized trials, we should have, so we talked about the data flow, the integration of the data. You know, when you think about a study cost, 50% of the cost are resources, and most of those are coming from resources on monitoring, on data management. So the ability to decrease that, I mean, there will be an ability to decrease that. In October, there was an interaction between the FDA and the US Pharma Association on decentralized trials, and a few of us had the opportunity to showcase some of the example we had and the design we had. And there is high interest, but one aspect that was raised is that how do we monitor that data? We have continuous monitoring. What is the value of all those data? How do we analyze that? How do we move from on-site monitoring to statistical monitoring? So I believe if we want, so that there will be a decrease in cost. So today there is an increase in cost because there is this additional aspects. There's all this home nursing to be added. So if you run a study and you ask for patient preference, and at Sanofi we've been long-standing with patient engagement, and again inherited from our rare disease experience, is that, well, you have patients who prefer to go on site and patients who prefer to have decentralized approaches. So you build on top. So you're adding. My guess estimate is that it's between 10 and 20K, depending on the per patient, depending on the type of study. So that's really one aspect that we need to take care, is that we need to redesign differently the study. We need to simplify them, because as we access to more digital tools, we access to more data. Just an example, if you take the Pulse, if you take the Pulse, I mean, on a 6-month study with 300 patients, it's something like less than 2,000 data points. If you have a continuous monitoring, it's 2 billion. So definitely, the data management approach needs to be totally different. So that's really also where we're gonna need to absorb the cost of the additional cost of putting a DCT, is really in revamping the way we collect data, we analyze data, and we clean data. But we have to engage with regulators.
Yes. I think I want to just underscore, double click on a few points here, because I think they're so good. Some that Lionel just made, and Badhri as well. In the long run, it will cost less. I think another question was around engagement, and if we'll see better adherence, and that participants will want to stay in trials and be more likely to enroll, especially for rare disease, which is also a very high priority for Takeda. And I think the answer on all that is yes. It will cost more to do it right. So in the short term, we've got to understand issues such as how to capture from, amidst the huge amount of data that we're going to be collecting from continuous monitoring, the right information. That's going to take different analysis, building in more flexibility in trials. That's going to change how we do statistical analyses. I think the collaboration, like what I talked about with the technology partners up front, that's talking about how do we develop a single platform user interface for patients across different vendor partners. So that is how we need to think differently, but it costs money up front. It takes a little more time up front, but it is customer centric in the end, and it will get us where we want to go. So we're spending the money up front because in the long run, we can more efficiently get to where we want to go and reach more patients, more diverse patients, and in a more personalized way, which is what we're going to need to do with the direction of travel and healthcare.
Just one point, if I may add, is as long as we use virtual and digital tools, but don't change the processes around them, and we use them as simply a proxy, as a replacement for a current non-virtual, non-digital tool, it will always cost more and it will never give us what we want. The only way this can happen better is digital tools have to be treated in a digital way, not digital tools in a manual way. This happened with EDC. When EDC was simply a paper CRF on the screen, it won't do anything other than being a paper CRF on a screen. That's not EDC. EDC is when you really change the process to do electronic data capture.
Completely. I think another big question on lots of people's mind is, what are the regulators thinking on this, and how will that affect the momentum going forward? Obviously, there's been a fair bit of flexibility during the pandemic. Maybe Antony can go first on this. Do you think that that's going to stick, and what are you hearing? Is there vast differences around the world?
Oh, sure. There's definitely differences around the world, and I think, when we were talking about last year in the beginning of the session here, I don't think anyone mentioned the regulators per se, but I think, let's give a shout out to the flexibility that the regulators around the world showed last year. I mean, a lot of what we all ended up doing was in crisis mode was because we had, we had guardrails, but maybe they were a little bit more flexy than they usually are. And I think that helped a lot. But I think there are questions about how much of that will stick, and can we continue building in that direction? It's very different by technology. It's very different by country. There are things like, video visits in ePro are seen, I think, very differently than fully decentralized trials and, electronic signatures on consent forms, depending on what country you're looking at. And so I think that has to be kind of a tech by tech and country by country evaluation. But I think certainly, and maybe going back to the last point that Badhri was just making too, I think we have to remember that the regulators, again, are just part of the equation. Most regulatory agencies are very open to hearing what sponsors want to try to do to make their clinical development programs work better for science and work better for patients. And so if we, if all of us decide that we want to take this kind of approach forward beyond just COVID, I think the regulatory environment for that will be very open. It doesn't mean they'll approve everything or that we'll get a nice, clean guidance 6 months from now that tell us exactly what we can and can't do. But I think we can push on that, and I think there's an openness to hearing those ideas right now.
Yeah.
Antony, I just want to. Sorry.
Sorry. No. Okay, go on, Badhri.
If I may add, on this, sorry for that. Yes, I mentioned about this interaction that we had with the FDA Pharma Association. So I guess FDA is really open to the new ways of running studies. There are a number of aspects that need to be validated, because when we talk about decentralized trials, we need to think about data collection, and digital biomarkers, wearables, and how do we validate that? Because how do we manage the variability? Because there is all the technology we can set to connect the patient and have a number of data collected, the usual data, EPRO. But then when it comes to endpoints, how do we develop the endpoints? How do we validate those endpoints? It's a long journey. At Sanofi, we took that journey for Parkinson's disease. It's been 3 years working on the development of this Parkinson's disease specific endpoint with multiple interactions. So there is an opening where I fully agree with Antony. I mean, regulatory is really open. I mean, it's up to us to come and be bold in some of the design that we want to conduct, because we're talking about decentralized approach, but there are also there is a new forum that has been created by the FDA to look at complex innovative design as well. That would be very beneficial for the patients, because we would limit the number of patients we need to in a study, working with Medidata on synthetic control arm, for instance. So that's really a new approaches that we need to push to the regulators. One last point is that even in Europe, we've been working for years within the private-public partnership with IMI, Innovative Medicine Initiative, on trial at home. So there is a number of biopharma working together to put this way of working, this way of running trials very differently. And it can have a very different definition in Europe, because Europe is today a multiple 25 different countries. But then you could think of having meta sites across different countries and then running studies across. So that's also an opportunity that exists, and we are pushing that discussion to the regulation.
Badhri?
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of points. Before I actually want to call out, as Antony did, the regulators as well for doing an amazing job through the COVID period and being super, super flexible and working with companies like us. So it's amazing. But 2 points I wanted to make. One, pre-COVID, we were in a situation where policy was dictating practice. There would be policy and the practice would adhere to the policy. During COVID, we shifted from policy dictating practice to practice informing policy. It really now was the point where companies like those in the meeting today really surged forward. I got to protect my patients. I got to protect my investigators. I got to protect the trial. Surged forward. Practice then started saying, how does policy catch up with it? And I think that's what we're seeing now. Practice has happened. Policy is catching up. And there will be a balance in this as well. And the second point as well is it's really hard, using a cliched phrase, it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. We did vaccine development in 7 months, or the industry did. It's really hard to now say, well, that was during COVID, now go back to doing it in 5 years. It's not possible, right? So I think the regulators will have openness. They've already shown openness. They've actually already shown openness to formalize what has happened during the COVID period, codify that and extend that. So I think we will see more opening.
On the point of regulation and broadly, to me, the bottom line is about collaboration. If we individually go to regulators about what we want to do, I think we'll have incremental change as we move forward that will take more time. If we work together across industry and across even a broader stakeholder, multi-stakeholder group, I think we can do more to leverage what's been happening now that's been so favorable and flexible from regulators to bring an increased amount of cross-regulator harmonization around how we've adjusted to COVID and the needs of the pandemic with increased flexibility. And if that could be more harmonized, that would benefit everybody. And if IRBs and the increased flexibility there could be more harmonized, it seems to me that we could do quite a bit to even stop mid-trial to actually get feedback from sites and from patients to make the experience work better for the rest of the trial. So if, for example, patients are really kind of getting tired of the number of CT scans in a longer term trial to monitor tumor growth, if it's been stable a year, maybe we can cut back in the second year to less frequent CT scans and not have as many people want to drop out because of the radiation exposure. I mean, that's just one example that we've heard, but we don't have a mechanism built in. But the flexibility that we're now seeing from regulators and IRBs and industry thinking, let's come together and think about what we can do as a silver lining and a lesson learned and work together to build in and collaborate on learnings moving forward. That's not just small incremental change, but really kind of multi-stakeholder. Here's how we can do better moving forward.
May I build 1 minute on this?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess, I mean, Jessica brought a very good point about the collaborations that we bring together. I guess that this is also what COVID-19 has magnified. We've been collaborating in many fronts. I could mention Transacelerate, but there are other forums where we've been collaborating. During the pandemic, we've been collaborating and supporting NIH and the Active initiative. So, but I mean, since we were talking about the regulator, very recently we announced, and Takeda is part of it, this accumulated synergy initiative. You know, to look at a different way to interact with the agencies. And if everyone recall, we moved from paper delivery of a dossier years ago. There was a full truck of papers sent to the FDA, to CD-ROM and electronic gateway. And soon we'll be able to have these cloud-based interactions, allowing for this simultaneous parallel submission and review. So I guess, and to
there are efforts for sure.
That's a big to digital trials. I mean, this type of trials where we can make rapid decision, online data reviews. We have this one is data, one data integration, online data review. You can pivot rapidly. Then maybe you can submit the data also very rapidly, particularly in the rare disease frame. That's really also something important, looking end to end at what we can build with the regulators.
And patients, and yeah, exactly. And sites too, to get feedback. I think, you know, thinking creatively about what might be missing from that engagement, and just thinking broadly to incorporate other stakeholders like we really haven't done before.
So we're coming up to our end soon, but I think you've all made some excellent points about how integrated this is, and this isn't about just new technologies sort of landing and transforming trials all by themselves. However, I did want to give you an opportunity just before we go. Is there anything that is exciting you about the potential for remote monitoring? Maybe it's not quite there yet, but in the future. Don't know if anyone wants to take that first.
Ariana, can you repeat the question? My Wi-Fi isn't unstable.
I was just asking if there's any technologies that are coming down the line, perhaps, that you do think will be really useful for virtual trials.
Well, I guess we alluded earlier on the sensors and the digital biomarkers, and to me this is some of as mentioned earlier by Jessica, some of the studies they require some invasive assessment or complex. Some of those could probably be more easily virtualized if we had if we developed the right endpoints and validate those endpoints. So this is one of the aspects that we need to build on, and I believe that everyone investing in that is a benefit to the community. And in each single trials we have wearables as the secondary or exploratory endpoints, and on actimetry, sleep, as mentioned about spirometry. That comes to my mind is this one.
Yeah, sure.
Hannah, so not specifically on the monitoring. I think what we're starting to move away from is even the technology being siloed. A technology for monitoring, a technology for data operations, a technology for, I don't know, patient handling or site handling, to actually now thinking end to end. What is the full experience end to end? How do I start and make sure that we are having one integrated approach to it? That to me is exciting, because we used to have local, if you will, optimums. And local optimums, I mean, it don't do anything, because once you optimize one area, another area goes out of control. You think end to end, and the technology becoming end to end, then we really can manage the full experience from start of the trial or start of a program to submissions. That's exciting for me.
Yeah, that is really exciting. Well, I think that you every panelist has done a wonderful job at laying out the sort of transformation their company has gone through in the last year. Even though you were all working on it before, it really does seem to have been a breakthrough year, and a breakthrough year that you can't go back from. And I think you've made some excellent points here about it being a cultural change, about it being about collaborating with everybody involved in the process, including the patients, the regulators, the investigators, and that really it's about giving as many options as possible while still getting that data that we need to get new drugs approved. And it's not necessarily just about sort of adding technology, but it's about focusing on all those things together. So thank you all very much for taking the time to speak to us. Thank you for the audience for so many great questions. We didn't get to all of them, but I hope we covered some of the main themes that you were really interested in. And thank you, Medidata, as our sponsor. And I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.